At dawn, beneath brittle frost and discarded tinsel, a county surveyor stopped at an unmapped culvert, noticing paper tags, boot impressions, and a winter coat caught on ice, evidence whispering that something waited beyond routine, demanding gloves, photographs, measurements, and silence before Christmas traffic returned under gray skies nearby quietly. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Missouri in December carries a particular stillness, and in 1998 that stillness settled over Cedar Ridge, a river town stitched together by Route 60, grain elevators, and brick storefronts that closed early for Christmas. The discovery triggered standard protocols. Photographs were logged, weather conditions recorded, evidence flagged. The victim was identified as Emily Carter, age 22, a community college student who worked evenings at a craft store preparing holiday displays. Her car was later found legally parked near a riverside lot, keys missing, purse intact, no signs of forced entry. Missing person flyers had already been printed after she failed to attend Thanksgiving dinner. Local papers noted the timing with restrained language, avoiding speculation. The medical examiner estimated death within days, citing hypothermia exposure indicators complicated by blunt force trauma evidence that was nonspecific, preserved clothing fibers, and trace soil consistent with the Culvert site. No defensive injuries were documented. Toxicology returned negative. The case file opened quietly, methodically, during a season when officers rotated shifts to attend school concerts and church services. Investigators canvassed familiar faces, logging alibis from co-workers, relatives, and commuters who shared the river road. Tire impressions were cast but yielded no immediate matches. A knit glove recovered downstream was cataloged and stored. Surveillance cameras were scarce in 1998, leaving timelines dependent on receipts, punch cards, and memory. Emily Carter's routine was reconstructed hour by hour, from a late shift before Christmas Eve to a planned drive home. Phone records showed no unusual calls. Bank activity was dormant. The town absorbed the news with muted resolve. Church bulletins listed her name. Snow fell lightly, then froze, sealing impressions and slowing answers until spring. Detectives archived reports, knowing cold cases begin as ordinary binders. Families waited through New Year's, listening for updates that did not arrive. By January, the file rested in a steel cabinet, labeled, dated, unresolved. Years would pass before that label changed. The town aged, roads repaved, memories dulled, evidence slept waiting for better tools. Time became both enemy and ally. It was not forgotten, just paused in records quietly, until reopening, in later years, it returned. Again, eventually, resolved. By the spring of 1999, Cedar Ridge returned to routines that left little room for grief. The Carter family pressed for progress, receiving courteous updates that explained the absence of leads without promising relief. Detectives reviewed their notes, verifying measurements and cross-checking early assumptions. The glove was tested for fibers and sweat residue, but the technology of the time offered limited discrimination. Soil samples confirmed the riverbank origin already assumed. Witness logs revealed nothing inconsistent. The case entered a maintenance phase, with annual reviews scheduled and evidence preserved under chain of custody. Holidays returned. Thanksgiving dinners passed with an empty chair. Christmas lights appeared and disappeared along Main Street. Emily Carter's name receded into memory, preserved by clippings and a scholarship fund established by her parents. In 2004, the department underwent a records digitization project. Old reports were scanned, index cards converted to searchable text. The cold case unit, newly formalized, identified Emily Carter's file as suitable for reassessment. A detective nearing retirement volunteered time, nodding that December cases often hide overlooked temporal details. He focused on transit patterns. The River Road had undergone repairs in late 1998, narrowing lanes and diverting traffic. Construction logs showed a temporary gravel access near the culvert. That access had been removed weeks after the discovery. Photos were re-examined. A faint tread pattern, once dismissed, matched a commercial winter tire popular among delivery fleets. The detail was logged. In 2008, advances in DNA analysis allowed testing of previously inconclusive items. The knit glove yielded a partial male profile, insufficient for identification but viable for future comparison. The profile entered CODIS as an unknown contributor. No immediate hits followed. The file returned to the shelf, thicker now, annotated with cautious optimism. Local reporters occasionally revisited the case near Christmas, their tone respectful, avoiding conjecture. The community listened, then moved on. A decade after the crime, a routine audit connected the winter tire pattern to a regional courier company that operated seasonal routes in 1998. Employment records were incomplete, but one subcontractor name recurred across manifests. The man had lived briefly in Cedar Ridge, then moved south. Background checks showed minor offenses, nothing violent. Investigators noted him and continued. In 2015, a cold case grant funded genealogical DNA research. The partial profile was uploaded to public databases following legal protocols. Months passed. Then a distant relative surfaced, pointing toward a family tree that narrowed possibilities. The name from the courier manifests appeared again, now with corroborating lineage. Surveillance was authorized. Trash pulls were conducted lawfully. A discarded cup provided a sample. The match probability exceeded accepted thresholds. Investigators rebuilt the timeline with renewed rigor. The suspect's route placed him near the craft store on Christmas Eve. Fuel receipts showed a stop along Route 60. Phone records, once unavailable, now retrievable through carriers, indicated proximity to the River Road during the relevant window. Interviews were conducted without spectacle. The suspect denied involvement, offered explanations that shifted subtly under scrutiny. A search warrant recovered items consistent with the glove fibers, preserved improbably among stored belongings. The arrest came quietly in November, just before Thanksgiving. Local press reported facts only. The courthouse felt familiar, worn by years. Pretrial motions tested the evidence and held. Expert testimony explained hypothermia markers, transfer fibers, and probabilistic DNA without flourish. The jury deliberated methodically. A verdict was reached: guilty. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines. Appeals were filed and denied. In Cedar Ridge, winter returned. The Carter family attended a small memorial, not triumphant, simply relieved. The scholarship fund continued. The file was closed, stamped solved. Investigators filed final notes acknowledging time and persistence. Christmas lights glowed again along Main Street, reflected in the river. The town exhaled, quietly. The years between arrest and final disposition unfolded with a slow inevitability familiar to anyone who had watched the justice system mature across decades. Pre-sentencing investigations documented the suspect's transient employment history, his brief residence in Cedar Ridge during the winter of 1998, and his abrupt departure in early January of the following year. Financial records showed no motive tied to theft or debt, reinforcing the prosecution's position that the crime was opportunistic, driven by proximity, timing, and access rather than planning or profit. The defense challenged memory decay, chain of custody, and the interpretation of partial DNA profiles, but the court's findings remained anchored in procedure and corroboration. For investigators, the case demanded a return to fundamentals. They revisited weather logs from December 1998, noting subfreezing nights followed by daytime thaws that explained the condition of the scene and the preservation of certain impressions. They compared archived photographs with modern mapping software, reconstructing sight lines from the road to the culvert and measuring distances that aligned with the suspect's vehicle height and reach. The methodical work did not seek drama. It sought consistency. Each step reaffirmed the earlier conclusions, lending weight to a case built patiently rather than spectacularly. Emily Carter's life was documented carefully for the record, without embellishment. Born and raised in Missouri, she balanced classes with work, saved money, and planned to transfer to a 4-year college. Friends described reliability and routine, characteristics that investigators translated into predictable movement patterns. Those patterns intersected with the suspect's route at a narrow window on Christmas Eve, a convergence that explained opportunity without invoking coincidence. The timeline, once fragile, now held. Media coverage remained measured. Local editors, many of whom remembered the original reporting, emphasized closure and restraint. They printed courthouse sketches, summarized filings, and quoted official statements rather than speculation. The audience, older and accustomed to waiting for answers, responded with letters recalling where they had been when the news first broke. The season amplified reflection. Thanksgiving columns spoke of gratitude tempered by remembrance. Christmas editorials acknowledged the weight of unresolved grief finally lifted, though not erased. Inside the courthouse, the physical environment mirrored the process. File rooms hummed with fluorescent light. Paper smelled faintly of dust and toner. Clerks retrieved binders labeled with years that seemed distant but suddenly relevant. Judges referenced precedent and statute, careful to articulate findings in language that would withstand appellate review. The verdict did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived with signatures and dates, entered into the docket as another resolved matter, significant to those it touched, procedural to the system that carried it. Sentencing reflected statutory boundaries. The court considered aggravating and mitigating factors, the absence of prior violent convictions, the severity of the offense, and the enduring impact on the victim's family. The imposed term acknowledged accountability without theatrical condemnation. The defendant was remanded to state custody, transferred through facilities whose routines were indifferent to notoriety. Appeals focused on evidentiary thresholds and expert qualifications. Higher courts affirmed the trial court's rulings, citing established standards and the sufficiency of corroboration. In Cedar Ridge, the aftermath unfolded quietly. Investigators returned borrowed equipment. Evidence lockers were reorganized. A final report summarized the case history from discovery through resolution, noting lessons applicable to other cold cases. The value of preserving even marginal samples, the importance of revisiting infrastructure changes, the patience required to align evolving technology with old facts. The report avoided self-congratulations. It emphasized continuity. The Carter family marked the conclusion privately. They met with prosecutors, reviewed the findings, and asked practical questions about records and memorials. Their scholarship fund continued to award modest grants each year, a gesture oriented toward future students rather than backward toward loss. The town council approved a small plaque near the library, understated, listing Emily Carter's name and year, without narrative. It became part of the landscape, noticed by some, passed by many. Seasonal rhythms resumed their hold. Snowplows traced familiar routes. Churches scheduled candlelight services. The river froze along its edges. For residents who had lived long enough to remember the winter of 1998, the solved case did not rewrite history. It clarified it. The knowledge settled into memory as fact rather than question. For younger residents, the story arrived already complete, a reminder of how time and diligence intersect. Within law enforcement circles, the case was cited during trainings as an example of incremental progress. Detectives discussed the transition from analog to digital records, the legal frameworks governing genealogical searches, and the ethical boundaries maintained throughout. The emphasis remained on lawful process. The case demonstrated that resolution need not rely on confession or spectacle, but on accumulation. As New Year's approached, Cedar Ridge prepared as it always had. Storefronts displayed practical decorations. Roads were salted. The courthouse closed early on holidays. In the background, the file labeled Emily Carter rested in a different cabinet now, marked closed, archived, but accessible. Its pages told a complete story, one that had taken years to finish and required no embellishment to endure. The quiet after resolution carried its own weight. There were no parades, no public reckoning beyond the formal record. There was only the recognition that a question had been answered and that the answer would stand. The town moved forward, carrying the memory without the burden of uncertainty. In winter, that mattered. With the appellate process complete, the institutional memory of the case shifted from active concern to archival reference. Prosecutors filed final compliance notices. Defense counsel closed their files. Court reporters indexed transcripts. The legal system, having spoken, moved on without ceremony. For Cedar Ridge, the significance lay less in punishment than in the confirmation that the long uncertainty surrounding December 1998 had reached a lawful conclusion grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Law enforcement agencies across Missouri quietly requested summaries, not for publicity, but for instruction. The case demonstrated how seasonal crimes could exploit predictable human behavior, particularly during holidays when routines compress and attention divides. Training materials highlighted the importance of retaining environmental data, such as weather fluctuations and infrastructure changes, that might appear trivial at first glance. The culvert, once just a drainage feature, became a lesson in overlooked geography. The winter tire pattern, initially dismissed, was cited as an example of patience rewarded by context. The cold case unit conducted a final internal review. Detectives spoke candidly about early limitations. In 1998, DNA databases were sparse, and the concept of genealogical searching had not entered standard practice. Surveillance coverage was minimal. Cell phone location data was rudimentary. The review underscored that the original investigators had followed accepted procedures of the era, preserving what they could without knowing which fragments would later prove decisive. That preservation bridged decades. Emily Carter's case also reshaped relationships between the department and the community. Trust had not been broken, but it had been tested by time. The resolution reaffirmed that unanswered questions were not synonymous with neglect. Local meetings reflected this understanding. Older residents, many retired, spoke about living through eras when crimes went permanently unresolved. They contrasted that experience with the present, acknowledging the role of evolving science and steady record-keeping. The tone remained reflective, not celebratory. Seasonal reporting returned one final time. The local paper ran a long-form piece during the Christmas season following sentencing. It avoided graphic detail and avoided speculation. Instead, it traced the procedural arc from discovery to conviction, emphasizing dates, methods, and restraint. The article closed with a brief acknowledgement of Emily Carter's age and aspirations, then shifted focus to the broader implication that time did not nullify accountability. Readers responded quietly, clipping the piece for scrapbooks rather than comment sections. For the Carter family, the years after closure were marked by adjustment rather than relief alone. Grief did not conclude with a verdict. It changed shape. They worked with victim advocacy services to navigate lingering administrative matters, including record corrections and memorial permissions. They declined interviews, choosing privacy. Their decision was respected. The system required no further participation from them, and they withdrew without pressure. The defendant entered the state correctional system as an older man, processed according to routine. Intake evaluations noted health concerns common to age. His classification reflected the conviction and sentence length, nothing more. Within that system, the case carried no special status. It was one of many, absorbed into schedules and regulations. The lack of spectacle was consistent with the case itself, which had never sought attention. From an investigative standpoint, the conclusion allowed for comparative analysis. Analysts reviewed other unsolved cases from the late 1990s with similar characteristics, particularly those involving transit corridors during winter months. Some files were reopened. Others were ruled out. The Carter case served as a reference point, not a template, reminding investigators that resolution often depends on alignment rather than replication. Cedar Ridge itself continued its gradual changes. New businesses replaced old storefronts. The riverfront was refurbished with benches and lighting. The culvert remained, altered by updated drainage systems, now marked clearly on municipal maps. Few residents connected it consciously to past events, yet it remained part of the physical record, a silent witness integrated into daily infrastructure. As Thanksgiving approached each year, local churches included general prayers for remembrance and gratitude, not nomming cases but acknowledging loss. Christmas Eve services emphasized quiet reflection, an ethos that mirrored how the town had carried the case. There were no annual reenactments, no commemorative events beyond the library plaque. Memory was allowed to rest. In professional circles, the case was occasionally cited in journals discussing cold case methodologies. Footnotes referenced the genealogical match and the corroborating non-DNA evidence that supported it. The emphasis was on balance, warning against over-reliance on any single technique. The Carter case succeeded because multiple independent elements converged within a lawful framework. As New Year's celebrations marked the passage of time, the contrast between 1998 and the present felt pronounced. Technology had advanced, procedures had refined, yet the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Document carefully, preserve diligently, revisit methodically. The case reinforced that those principles endure beyond trends. The final administrative act occurred when the evidence locker released remaining items for disposal or return, following statutory waiting periods. Each item was checked, logged, and either destroyed or archived according to policy. The knit glove, now fully documented, was sealed and retained for historical reference. The act was procedural but symbolic of closure. For those who remembered the early days, the solved case altered the way December was recalled. The season no longer carried an unanswered question, only a memory contextualized by facts. That distinction mattered to an older audience accustomed to living with unresolved histories. The knowledge that patience and structure had prevailed offered a quiet reassurance. In the end, the Missouri 1998 case did not redefine justice. It reaffirmed it. It showed that resolution can arrive without drama, that accountability can be established years later through lawful means, and that communities can absorb difficult truths without fracture. The story concluded not with spectacle, but with order restored, records complete, and a winter town continuing forward, mindful of the past but no longer held by it. As the final year closed on the docket, Cedar Ridge settled into a quieter understanding of what resolution meant. It did not erase December 1998, nor did it replace the memory of a young woman whose life had stopped at 22. It replaced uncertainty with record, rumor with fact, and waiting with an ending that could be carried without speculation. For those who had lived long enough to remember earlier eras, that distinction mattered. The courthouse stored the completed file in climate-controlled archives, a routine act that nonetheless marked transition. Labels were updated, cross-references added, digital backups verified. The case now existed as a complete chronology accessible to future auditors, students, and investigators. It no longer required guardianship. It required preservation. The town understood the difference. Each winter thereafter, Cedar Ridge continued to mark time in familiar ways. Roads were cleared before dawn. Shopkeepers unlocked doors with gloved hands. Radios carried weather reports and measured voices. The library plaque remained understated, its presence neither promoted nor hidden. Some paused to read it. Most passed by. Memory did not demand constant attention to remain intact. For law enforcement, the case informed quiet reforms. Evidence intake forms were revised to emphasize seasonal context. Training emphasized documentation over intuition. Partnerships with state laboratories expanded. None of these changes bore Emily Carter's name publicly, but the influence was there, woven into procedure. That was how institutions learned, incrementally. The Carter family maintained their decision to remain private. They attended graduations funded by the scholarship bearing Emily's name, sitting in back rows, applauding without ceremony. They measured progress not by headlines but by ordinary milestones achieved by others. In that way, the legacy shifted from loss to continuity. The defendant's appeals having been exhausted, the sentence became final. Annual reviews addressed health and placement as required by policy. There were no further legal developments. The case did not return to court. Stability replaced motion. The justice system, having completed its role, stepped aside. Academic discussions occasionally reference the case when addressing the maturation of forensic genealogy. The emphasis remained ethical compliance and corroboration. Scholars noted that the decisive factor had not been technology alone, but the patience to wait until technology could be applied responsibly. The lesson resonated with audiences accustomed to seeing haste produce error. Local journalism marked the anniversary once more, then let it pass. Editors recognized that repeated coverage could distort memory. The final article acknowledged closure and directed attention to current civic concerns. The community accepted that balance. Stories had their seasons. As Thanksgiving dinners gathered families, conversations sometimes drifted to recollections of past winters. The Carter case entered those conversations as a finished chapter. There was sadness, but no argument about what had happened. Facts held. That certainty allowed remembrance without dispute. Christmas Eve services remained subdued. Candles flickered. Choirs sang familiar hymns. The town's rhythm favored reflection over display. In those moments, the absence of unresolved questions felt like a gift earned through patience rather than luck. From a broader perspective, the case demonstrated how time could serve justice without spectacle. Evidence preserved faithfully could outlast witnesses. Records maintained carefully could speak when memories failed. The process honored restraint, an approach valued by those who had seen systems falter under pressure. The Missouri winter of 1998 would always remain cold in memory, but it no longer carried a shadow without edges. The outline was known. The facts were fixed. That clarity mattered to a generation that valued order and accountability. In the end, the solved case altered nothing visible about Cedar Ridge. The river flowed as before. Roads carried traffic. Seasons turned. What changed existed beneath the surface, in the confidence that diligence mattered and that even delayed answers could arrive intact. The final notation in the archive summarized the outcome in neutral language, listing evidence, verdict, and sentence. It ended with a date and initials. No flourish, no commentary. The record stood complete. For those who listened closely, that quiet completeness was the story's true conclusion. The community had waited, the system had worked within its limits, and the answer had come without excess. In a town accustomed to enduring winters, that was enough. Looking back across the full span of years, observers noted how the investigation mirrored the lives of those who followed it. Time compressed memories, changed priorities, and tested faith in institutions. Yet the steady accumulation of verified facts resisted erosion. The case demonstrated that careful stewardship of evidence could bridge generational divides, allowing one era to answer questions posed by another. Cedar Ridge's municipal records reflected this continuity. Council minutes from the late 90s mentioned road maintenance and holiday events, not crimes. Later minutes referenced grants, upgrades, and training initiatives shaped indirectly by lessons learned. The connection was subtle but present, a reminder that public administration absorbs experience quietly. For retired officers who had walked the River Road in 1998, the resolution offered professional closure. They reviewed the final report with measured satisfaction, nodding where assumptions had been corrected by later data. The experience reinforced humility, the understanding that certainty must be earned repeatedly rather than assumed once. Community education programs incorporated the case as a teaching example, stripped of names and drama. Students learned about timelines, evidence preservation, and ethical boundaries. The emphasis remained procedural. In that environment, the story became a tool rather than a spectacle. The seasons continued to frame memory. Autumn brought harvest festivals. Winter brought snow and reflection. Spring brought thaw and renewal. Summer brought routine. Through each cycle, the resolved case remained stable, no longer changing with rumor or revision. The legal record, accessible by request, provided transparency without intrusion. Interested citizens could review filings, rulings, and expert testimony summaries. Few did. The availability itself was the point. Trust rested on access rather than attention. At a personal level, residents recalibrated how they remembered 1998. The year regained its other markers, whether extremes, local elections, births, and retirements. The crime no longer dominated recollection. It took its place among many events, defined and bounded. In professional literature, the case underscored the necessity of interagency cooperation. Local knowledge combined with state resources and national databases produced resolution. None alone would have sufficed. The collaboration model informed subsequent protocols. During one particularly cold December, a local radio host mentioned the case briefly while discussing winter preparedness. The reference was factual, respectful, and brief. Listeners understood without elaboration. The story required no retelling to remain known. The final impact of the solved case lay in its ordinariness. It did not redefine a town, topple institutions, or inspire movements. It confirmed that steady work, preserved records, and lawful process could withstand time. For an older audience familiar with long arcs, that confirmation resonated. As another new year arrived, Cedar Ridge marked the moment quietly. Fireworks echoed at a distance. Snow reflected streetlights. The town entered the next calendar with its past intact and its questions answered. That balance between memory and movement defined the quiet aftermath. The Missouri 1998 cold case rested where it belonged, not forgotten, not sensationalized, but resolved, documented, and folded into the enduring record of a community that had waited for answers and received them. In this way, the story concluded not with emphasis but with acceptance. The facts stood independent of feeling, yet they allowed feeling to settle. The investigative arc closed cleanly, leaving behind a framework others could rely on. For those who valued order over drama, the resolution affirmed a belief held quietly across years. The winter air still carried the same bite. The courthouse clock still marked hours. Life continued without annotation. The answer had arrived, and with it, the permission to remember without wondering. That was the lasting measure of the case, and of the season that finally let it rest. Across Missouri, similar files waited, each with its own season and patience. The Carter case offered no promise of speed, only proof of possibility. It reminded those who carried files home in boxes or kept notes in margins that time could be an ally if work remained careful. For Cedar Ridge, that understanding became part of the town's character. Winters would come and go, records would endure, and when answers finally emerged, they would do so without noise, fitting the place that had held the question for so long. In the end, the case closed as it should, with certainty grounded in evidence and restraint, leaving a community older, steadier, and able to face future winters knowing that patience and method had proven sufficient. The file remained accessible, the lesson enduring, the memory contained, and the season reclaimed, a quiet testament to diligence, lawful resolve, and the long work of justice completed without spectacle. At last, for those who waited through holidays, years, and winters with patience alone.